So I think we're gonna get started. People can still join the event. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Before we begin, I would like to point out that this meeting is being simultaneously translated into Spanish. So in the screen, you can see now the instructions. And for the policy discussion that will be held in Spanish, we will also have translation into English. In order to change the language, you can go to the meeting control settings, which might look like a globe here, like the one that I have here on the screen, or 3 dots on your phone, and then you can select either English or Spanish. You can also select mute original language in order to hear the language that you have selected only and not the original one. And if you have trouble doing this, you can also send us a question on the Q&A function, so one of the members of the team can support you with that. Para cambiar el idioma, para las personas que necesitan traducción simultánea a inglés, pueden ir a los controles de la función de Zoom y elegir la opción en el globo o los 3 puntos en su teléfono y ahí podrán elegir inglés o español. Y también pueden silenciar el audio original para que solamente escuchen el idioma que ustedes han seleccionado. So welcome to the webinar, Transportation Infrastructure in Medellín, Importing Opportunity or Exporting Crime. I'm Ana Serrano, I'm the Policy Manager at Innovations for Poverty Action in Colombia, and I will be moderating the event today. Today's webinar is the 4th out of the webinar series on crime and violence in the Latin American and the Caribbean region, co-hosted by Innovations for Poverty Action, the Becker Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago and Princeton University. Chris Bladman, Ramali E. Professor, Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago, Research Associate at MBER and co-organizer of the webinar series, together with Michaela Sviatsky, Assistant Professor at Princeton University, will give an introduction today on the crime and violence in Latin America webinar series and the motivation behind it. So Chris, please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to be really brief. Thank you for joining. This is a regular series. Usually it's every month. We're going to be pausing for the summer and restarting in September. We're really focused initially. Meek and I are both really passionate about trying to improve violence and crime in Latin America, and with a particular focus on organized crime, which we think is really understudied. So at least for the first year or so, we think this series is going to focus on strategies for understanding organized crime. And so Jorge today is talking about Medellín, which is an area that I work in, and maybe one of the cities with the most organized crime on the continent. So I'm excited about this. We're hoping to have people also not just talk about Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America this fall. We're going to be bringing in some experts to talk about how Italy combated the mafias in Napoli and in Sicily. We're going to be looking at some work in the United States and how gangs and organized crime were combated here and what lessons there might be for the Americas and for other countries. So I hope you'll join us again in September, and I'll hand it back to Anna.
Thank you, Chris. So continuing with the discussion on novel research, as Chris mentioned, in crime and violence, today we will explore new evidence on the relationship between the spatial distribution of criminal activity and formal employment, as well as the relationship with connectivity. To speak about this research, today we have Jorge Tamayo, Assistant Professor of Business Administration in the Strategy Unit at Harvard Business School, and to comment on the policy implications of this work, we also welcome Fernando Agudelo, Executive Director of Medellín Cómo Vamos. So before we begin, a few housekeeping notes for everyone to get started. We will start with the presentation on Jorge's research, followed by comments on his policy implication by Luis Fernando, and then we will address some questions we have received from the audience throughout the event. I would like to ask you if you have questions during the event, you can submit them using the Q&A function here, and please share your name and affiliation so the speakers can know where the question is coming from. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the event. It is likely that we will not be able to answer all of the questions, but we will do our best to get them all at the end of the event. So the webinar is also being recorded and it will be available to watch after the event is over. And we appreciate if you can share the link with any colleagues that you think might be interested in joining. También para recordarles que contamos con la traducción simultánea en español. Si necesitan ayuda con esto, pueden usar la opción del Q&A.
So thanks so much, Anna, and also thank you so much to Chris and Mika. I'm very, very happy to present these joint work with Gaurav Khanna, Carlos Medina, Anand Naishadam, and two grad students, Daniel Ramos and Audrey Tu. Basically, this paper is about access to jobs in different parts of the city and how that affects how do you get involved in crime. So I want to start with two very important facts. The first one comes from the literature on segregation, right? And that is how economic opportunity and crime are uniquely distributed in cities, right? So the problem for academics and policymakers is that segregation is both cause and consequence of interplay between a legitimate and illegitimate activity, right? And as a result of such segregation, neighborhoods are often a strong predictor of both economic opportunity and criminal activity, right? And that is what makes this topic really difficult to study, that because of the cycles that you have here. So segregation can cause differences in who gets involved in criminal activity or in different activities, right? But these may increase again segregation. So the direction of causality can be very difficult to disentangle, right? The second fact comes from the canonical models of crime, right? Which depict criminal activity as a rational choice in the face of limited legitimate alternatives, right? So basically, from these models, we know that there is an opportunity cost of getting involved in crime, and that depends basically on formal jobs alternatives. Now, an important implication of these two facts is that the transportation infrastructure can help to connect poor populations segregated from opportunities to more economically active parts of the city, which may help to reduce crime, right? So if I can access jobs basically in downtown, my opportunity cost of getting involved in crime will be higher, which I will basically less likely to get involved in criminal activity. Now, but the issue is that you all really see that people worry about these mass transit expansions, right? And in some cases, people blocked these mass transit expansions because they were concerned that crime may come into their neighborhoods, usually affluent neighborhoods, right? So there are two great examples, the case of Atlanta and Baltimore, the same thing happened in LA and DC. So our research question in this paper is the following. Thus, improving connectedness between segregated and unequal parts of the city import opportunities, right, to the connected neighborhoods, to the newly connected neighborhoods, or export crime to other parts of the city that now may be connected to neighborhoods with gangs, right? So in this paper, we are just trying to understand how does this connectivity affect opportunities and crime across neighborhoods. Now, tackling this question poses some important challenges. The first one is that, of course, there are spatial spillovers across these geographic units. And in our case, these geographic units will be just the neighborhoods, right? So they are spatial spillovers across neighborhoods, right? And let's say there are two types of spatial spillovers. The first one is that, to explain the first one is that, think that if you want to understand the impact of connecting a part of the city to a mass transit project, like in our case, these cable cars, you really don't have a treated and control group, right? So suppose you want to understand the impact of building these public transportation expansions, of building a cable car, like in our paper. You may think that the neighborhoods that are close to these new stations of this cable car are the treated groups, right? And that the control groups are those neighborhoods who are not close to the stations of this new cable car. The issue is that in reality, people might move to other neighborhoods and all parts of the city basically are indirectly affected by the expansion of the public transportation program. So in this context, you don't have a treated and control group, which makes it very difficult to study. But not only you have these type of spatial linkages, there are also cross-sectorial externalities that are very subtle, but are very important. So let me give you an example to understand what do I mean by these cross-sectorial externalities. So if crime goes up in one specific neighborhood, these will affect businesses in that neighborhood. And it might be that businesses in that neighborhood might shut down, right? And as a result of that, crime will increase again. So we have these spatial linkages and these cross-sectoral externalities that need to be taken into account, right? And to deal with these issues, we are going to use these spatial equilibrium models that have been very popular in recent years. So suppose you know how to deal with these issues that I just mentioned, right? There are still important data limitations, right? Because if you want to use these type of models, we need to know individuals' origin destination flows by activity. Basically, we need to know where do people live, where they work, and where they commit their crimes, right? So, but we also need exogenous variation in crime and the transportation costs, right? So in our context, to solve these two issues, we're going to use data from for Medellin, which is a high crime setting, as Chris mentioned, and which most of its transportation system was built between 2003 and 2019, which basically will give us variation in the transportation cost to the individuals of Medellin, to the citizens of Medellin. Now, as I said before, the literature close to our paper is the one on segregation that typically has a study if it's possible to reduce employment segregation by linking neighborhoods, right? And there is this other literature that is very important that studies basically crime and economic opportunity that are related to our paper. But in this paper, we are going to leverage from the recent literature on spatial equilibrium models to answer our research question, right? However, in our context, we need to add one important component to these models, and that is that we need to include the externalities across sectors to these canonical models. And we think that that's very important. And let me explain to you why that is very important. So suppose that there are more criminals in a specific neighborhood, let's say Castilla in Medellin, right? So these will affect formal businesses in Castilla, right? That is, businesses will have a trouble functioning in Castilla due to extortions and other criminal activities, right? Moreover, if business shut down, so there will be fewer formal jobs in Castilla. And if there are no jobs in Castilla, people may get involved in crime, right? So more crime, less formal jobs, which implies, again, more crime. So we have this vicious cycle driven by these cross-sectoral externalities that are very important that may generate segregation, right? And may generate these crime sinkholes. So what the transportation network does is that it breaks this vicious cycle. So you can find formal jobs in other parts of the city, like downtown, right? And the transportation network basically can break this vicious cycle, can break crime sinkholes equilibrium, right? Also, if you have more formal workers, return to crime may decrease, which may disincentivize crime. And we think that this is new to this literature and is relevant for policymakers. Now, I want to give you the key takeaways in case I have to run at the end of the presentation. So in our context, we find that those living in newly connected neighborhoods are less likely to choose crime sector. So there is what we call the import of opportunity. So basically, people living in segregated neighborhoods can use these new public infrastructure to go to downtown and get an informal job. This is what we call import of opportunity to the poor and segregated neighborhoods. Now, conditional on the sector choice, criminals substitute from local to distant crimes, right? So this is the export of criminal activity to other parts of the neighborhoods. But what is really, really important and really fascinating here is that we find that aggregate crime decreases by almost 10%. I'm going to show you in which specific context, and welfare increases by almost 2.3% for the whole city. So this is very important. Now, let me say something about the context. So we are going to study these externalities in the context of Medellin. Medellin was for many years the most violent city in the world, right? Particularly when the when Medellin was under the control of the Medellin cartel, right? So even after, and what is interesting is that even after Escobar died, the homicide rate, has been falling, right? After the peak in 1992, right? But even with low levels of homicide rate, Medellin was one of the most violent cities, was one of the 10 most violent cities in the world in 2010. What is really interesting is that after the Medellin cartel broke up, the number of gangs increased to around 300 well-defined street gangs that are spread out across the city. Of course, Chris is the expert here, so if you want to know more about these gangs, you will have to go to his paper. So that's Medellin. Another important point here in this context is that economic incentives are very salient, right? And the gang members talk about how they join these gangs because it is a preferable career. They get promoted over time and they can make a lot of money, of course, if they survive. So usually they will start, gang members will start selling drugs, they will move to property crimes, and finally they will move to violent crimes. Interesting is that due to this gang presence in these neighborhoods, gangs approach or target adult youths that live in these neighborhoods, right? So youths of these neighborhoods need to choose if they work for the gang or do a formal job. Of course, sometimes youths basically do not have alternatives. They just need to join the gang or move to a different neighborhood. Also, from our own research describes how less access to formal jobs may lead to more criminality in this setting. So we have two papers. The first one, we show that when people lose their job, when there are these mass layoffs, right, they get involved in criminal activities. And we show in the paper how credit access, right, access to credit can help them to avoid this option. We also have a paper that shows that when you change the opportunity costs or the return to be formally employed, people will get involved in crime. So let me be clear: is that if you increase the return to be informally employed, we show in that paper that people will get involved in crime, right? So economics incentives are very, very important to these occupational choices. Now, here we have the cable cars. Here we have the protagonist. So Medellin is in a valley, right? And it has these steep slopes along which a lot of the slums are right? Along these slopes. And given that we have these steep slopes, the public transportation system relies on these cable cars that started in 2003. So they are going basically from the top of the mountain down to the river that connect with the metro and downtown. And this is a picture of the cable that was built in 2004, and this is a picture of the cable that was built in 2008. And this is how the public transportation system expanded in the last decade. So they built these cable lines in 2004 and 2008. They built the bus rapid transit in 2012, Tram line 2016, and they just opened the new cable line, I think it was last week. So we are going to leverage the variation in the first two expansions, the cables lines built in 2004 and 2008, and use the rest of expansions to perform counterfactuals. And I will be specific about what do I mean by these counterfactuals. Again, this is the map of Medellin. So in the middle, you have the valley, you have the river, and here in light blue, we have the metro line that runs through the base next to the river. So here in purple, we have the cable that was built in 2004. And this other one is the cable, this here in purple was the other cable that was built in 2008. This is the bus rapid transit built in 2012, okay? Now here in this paper, we're going to combine different administrative data, right? We are going to use data of the CISBEN for 2002, 2005, and 2010. The CISBEN basically is the census of the 70% poorest, right, households, and we have the coordinates of these households. We are going to use data for the universe of arrests between 2002 and 2015. What is really fascinating about this data is that we also have the coordinates of these arrests. We're going to use data for Cámara de Comercio and Pila. Basically, these are data on all registered firms, employer-employee data match, and monthly wages. And we also have data on land registering and rent expenditure. And to compute the commute times, right, from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, let's say downtown, we're going to, we used Google API and ArcGIS. Great. So I want to tell you very quickly 3 facts that I think that are very important for Medellin, right? So the first fact is that there are these and this fact is, I think, is not only for Medellin. I think there are common across different cities in Latin America, common issues across different cities in Latin America, and as well as recent histories of many large cities in developed countries like New York, LA, and Chicago. And the point here is that there is a lot of segregation, right? On the left, I have the share of neighborhoods involved in crime. So these individuals who get involved in crime live in the northeast, northwest, and the outskirts of the city. Lots of segregation, whereas a lot of the formal city takes place in downtown and southwest of the city. Fact number two, this is very interesting. The other thing that we see in the data is that if you are engaging in a formal sector job, you're willing to pay more in terms of your travel cost, right? So formal sector workers travel farther to do their activities, whereas a lot of crime takes place in your own neighborhood, right? And I think this is consistent with Chris' paper that shows that a lot of these crimes basically occur in the same neighborhood where these criminals live. So commute time for criminals are much lower relative to formal workers, right? Fact number three is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how neighborhoods respond when they are connected to these cable cars, right? So for instance, in 2004, the one I have in the left, they built this cable car in the northeast of the city. And this part of the city basically has a high presence of gangs. And what you see is that there was less crime in the neighborhoods close to the station. So in green, I have the neighborhoods, what happened with the homicides, with the crime, with the violent crime in the neighborhoods close to the station. But then in 2018, Medellin connected a low-income neighborhood to a gang neighborhood, right? And you see that more individuals are engaging in crime near the stations, right? So the tricky thing here is that the point here is that there's a lot of heterogeneity on the impact of these cable cars. Of course, what is tricky here is that we're assuming that neighborhoods that are close to the stations are the treated neighborhoods. But as I said before, you cannot assume that, right? Because all the neighborhoods are indirectly affected by these cable cars. But what is really interesting is that we find that on average, right, the cable car was important reducing crime for neighborhoods with high baseline criminal activity, right? So notice that for neighborhoods with a low baseline criminal activity, basically what I'm doing here is just comparing the crime before and after the cable was built. And what you see is that for neighborhoods with a low baseline criminal activity, the crime goes up, but for neighborhoods with a high baseline criminal activity, the crime goes down, right? And basically you can do the same thing. You can check what happened over time, and the story is basically the same. Now, I want to talk very quickly about our model. I'm not going to, of course, show you the whole model. I just want to describe the model, right? So, the model is very simple. In a neighborhood, individuals basically choose between engaging in criminal activity or formal sector activities, right? And the transportation time and commuting cost will determine where they commit their crimes, if they engage in criminal activities, and where they choose to work if they engage in formal or legal activities, right? Now, the rollout of the cable give us variation in the transport time, right? Because before and after the cable was built, the transport time or the commuting cost change, right? For these individuals of close to the stations. Now, when they commit the crime, there is this negative externality that will affect businesses, right? That will affect the productivity of the businesses. And to identify these externalities, we are going to use this extradition of the crime lords in 2009. Basically, this was the extradition of Don Berna and the spike in crime after this extradition, okay? All these will determine where formal sector production takes place, which determine the wages in different parts of the city and the expected return to committing a crime in different parts of the city and the expected wages, right? With that, of course, this will determine, again, the job sector this will determine the choice of the sectors, whether you want to engage in crime or whether you want to engage in a formal work. So basically after, and the last piece that is important in here is that after seeing your wages and where the jobs are, you can choose right? You can choose to migrate. You can choose your residence conditional on the property price, right? Sorry, it's here. You can choose your residence conditional on the property price. So this is a equilibrium model. It's a full model. And the key here is that these expected returns to committing a crime and the expected wages of a formal job affect your sector, whether you engage in crime or whether you engage in a formal work, okay? In a formal job, great. Now, as I said before, I'm not going to show you how we estimate the model, and I'm going to show you the interesting piece, and I'm not going to show you the details of the model. I'm going to show you what I think is interesting is that we are going to going to show you the counterfactuals. And what do I mean by that? So the first exercise we did is the following. In 2016, Medellín built the Tram line, the one that I have here in purple, right? That connected the high crime neighborhoods in the east part of the city, right? This is the Tram of Ayacucho, right? And we can use our model fundamentals to understand the impact of building this Tram line in 2016. And this is the result. Basically, the result is that connected neighborhoods see a decrease in 10% of the probability of becoming a criminal, right? Basically, the map shows that the percentage change of becoming a criminal condition on living in a specific neighborhood. And this percentage decrease in the probability of becoming a criminal is, I will show you in a minute, is larger. So here on the left, I have, on the x-axis, I have the commute time, and on the y-axis, I have the probability of the reduction in crime, right? So basically, this percentage decrease in the probability of becoming a criminal is larger for more remote neighborhoods. So for those neighborhoods for which they have really, really high commuting times, the probability of becoming a criminal is lower, right? And it is in these neighborhoods that benefit the most from being connected to the transport network, given that previously before 2016, they didn't have basically access to these opportunities, to these formal jobs that are in downtown. Now, what I have here is that the expected welfare goes up, right? Because you are reducing the transport cost, but also because you are reducing aggregate crime in the city, right? Which I mentioned before, that has this negative externality to the firms, to the formal jobs of the city, right? Now, I'm going now very quickly. I'm running out of time. So the second counterfactual we did is that sorry, before I move, let me just show you something that is very interesting. As I said before, the reduction in criminal activity is proportional to the travel time. And what we have here is that we have a larger effect for neighborhoods with a larger decline in average commuting costs. So for those neighborhoods who experience this decline in commuting costs, they will experience the higher decrease in the homicide rate, in the crime. But as you see on this figure on the left, there is a lot of heterogeneity across neighborhoods. So, so this is the import of crime. This is the import of opportunities that goes to these newly connected neighborhoods, right? However, notice that on the map, the figure on the right, notice that there is also a bit of export of crime. That is, when you look at the destinations of where crimes are getting committed, there are basically fewer crimes getting committed in these neighborhoods that were connected to this new cable tram line, but more crimes are getting committed in other neighborhoods, in other parts of the city. So there are these two forces. You have this import of opportunities, but also export of crime. But remember, aggregate crime decreases and welfare increases by 2.34%. So that's important. Now, very quickly, we did the same thing with the cable that just was opened last week, and we find a small reduction in the probability of people getting involved in these criminal activities. We find a decrease of 7% instead of 10%, right? So this smaller effect on the probability of becoming a criminal is due to, basically, there's one reason for that. And the reason is that the new cable line is going to connect neighborhoods that were already relatively well connected, right? So the question, of course, is for policymakers is which neighborhoods should be targeted, right? Basically, which neighborhoods should one target to produce the best city level outcomes, right? Now, the answer to this question is that reduce the average commute times in each neighborhood, right? Sorry, to answer this question, what we're going to do is that we're going to decrease the average travel time in each neighborhood by 10%. And basically, this is similar to a policy where we subsidize ride sharing, right? Or you subsidize taxis to these neighborhoods, or give cars to the residents of these targeted neighborhoods. So we are going to reduce the travel time by 10%. And what I have here on the left, let me just talk about the figure on the left, is that connecting, and on the y-axis, I have the commuting market axis, and I will tell you what do I mean by that. Basically, that is, this is an index that captures whether workers that live in a specific neighborhood have good access to formal jobs. That is on the y-axis, and on the that is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, I have the probability of engaging in criminal activity. So the figure on the left basically has a clear message, and that is connecting neighborhoods that have the lowest formal sector commuting market access, right? Which is this index that let me repeat that because that is important, which is this index that basically captures whether workers that live in a specific neighborhood have good access to formal job. So connecting neighborhoods that have the lowest formal sector commuter market access, these formal jobs commuter market access at the baseline are likely to lead to the largest reductions in criminality for the city, right? And the largest increases in rental prices, right? Now, let me just, I think I'm running out of time, so let me just conclude very quickly by saying that the spatial distribution of criminal activity, right, and legitimate employment are interlinked by neighborhoods, right, by neighborhood segregation, right, and access to different neighborhoods. So changes to the transit network can affect these relationships in a manner that can change the overall levels of crime and formal employment in cities like Medellín. Thus, to study the impact of expansions, right, in this transportation infrastructure is very important, right, given the segregation that we have in the city, to understand how these expansions of the public transportation affect not only the stations, not only the neighborhoods that are close to the stations, but the entire city, right? I think that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.
So I think we can continue with Luis Fernando's comments.
Thank you. Good morning for everyone. My name is Luis Fernando Gudello. I'm the executive responsible of Medellín Cómo Vamos. Medellín Cómo Vamos is a private initiative. The goal of Medellín Cómo Vamos initiative is analysis of quality of life and participation in design and evaluation of public policy in Medellín in metropolitan area. Voy a hacer la intervención en español, pues agradecerles por esta oportunidad, agradecerle obviamente a Jorge y a LIPA y a la Universidad de Princeton por este espacio. Yo quisiera dividir estos comentarios que voy a desarrollar en tres partes.
I'm going to share with you into 3 different sections. So here I will refer to some essential theoretical reflections on what Jorge has just shared with us, to look at aspects related to mobility, access to transport, and spatial segregation so that we can look at Medellín's reality. I would also like to talk about the rationale behind decisions and trade-off behind criminal activities versus formal opportunities. And I will then close with policy opportunities that arise from the kind of research that Jorge has just shared with us for a city such as Medellín, and also I'll talk about what we do as Medellín Cómo Vamos. So what has just been shared by Jorge poses a question as to whether or not better connectivity in neighborhoods leads to better access to employment opportunities. And if we see also the transfer of security issues from less safe neighborhoods to safer neighborhoods. So the design of the mass transport system in the city of Medellin, the metro, cable cars, and the tram line have been developed keeping in mind the prioritization of offering transport alternatives from traditionally underserved neighborhoods in terms of transport to the metro system and also to the city's financial center. Methodologically, as Jorge said, we use a general balance framework to understand individuals' decisions as to whether or not they decide to work or engage in criminal activity. And essentially, this is related to a specific part of the population. We look at young people, more specifically young men who are in more socioeconomically disadvantaged areas of the city. So that's basically what we see from the project. The research project also concludes with, and this is what I will get to when I talk about the four fundamental concepts involved here, is that we have to look at whether or not better connectivity reduces criminal activity in general, and if it improves welfare. Obviously, some parts of the transport system do this better than others, and this also depends a lot on the previous status of the neighborhood in question. And also we have to look at whether or not there is a possibility that criminal activity be shifted from less safe neighborhoods to what have traditionally been safer cities. With regards to the theoretical aspects here, there are factors that we must take into account, for example, accessibility. And I think that we have to look at how attractive a place is and the potential that it has to offer opportunities. And we have to look at these objective characteristics and how much they might move somebody to move towards them. So that's what we understand as accessibility. When it comes to mobility, it's talking about the logics and practices of each actor, how an actor decides to relate to spaces. So that is to say, what are the opportunities that the territory or the space offers, and how can you enjoy those opportunities? From that perspective, when it comes to a city such as ours, the transport decisions that are made obviously have a methodological aspect that has to be taken into account for studies of this type in the future. There are three factors that we have seen in the literature and both in the reality of our city. Urban residents of a city such as ours and low-income neighborhoods have three factors to take into account. Firstly, physical access to transport. Secondly, the frequency of that transport. And thirdly, the commute cost or trip cost. So given that the majority of neighborhoods that have been connected with these transport systems are low-income households, where traditionally we've seen buses, these new modes of connectivity or transport decisions, given that new transport options have high costs, then usually people give preference to other options. In an urban context such as Medellin, when income opportunities are mediated by these transport decisions are not made individually. Decisions are made in terms of looking at whether or not you will have to deprive one or more members of your household of being able to access transport. So for future methodologies, we believe that there's a methodological need to look at how transport needs are made in a household context and not necessarily at the individual level. That's very understandable. We understand the methodological decision was taken based on the data available, but looking at the reality of Latin America, Colombia, and specifically Medellin, it's important to understand that transport decisions end up affecting several household members rather than just one single. And so when it comes to the cable car, This goes beyond the simple construction of a transport system and also has urban renewal, institutional presence, and also the difficulty of taking large pieces of luggage on these transport systems. And also, you are not allowed to consume food or drink on these transport systems. Those are all realities, have had an impact, and have led to these transport options not being intensively used by the neighborhoods at hand.
Hay elementos muy particulares del proceso de segregación.
With regard to spatial segregation, there are some important details in the case of Medellin that I will not share with you now due to time limitations. I'd like to now speak on policy recommendations. And it's that there's a question from this paper with regard to whether segregated and equal parts of the cities will lead to import or exports of crime. And I believe there are 4 important elements I'd like to highlight. And it's that transportation costs continue to be high, and the trade-off that citizens make with regard to how to manage segregation have an additional element when it comes to transportation cost. And so in the case of Medellin from 2010 to now, the number of motorcycles have practically tripled. So when it comes to transportation decisions and overcoming segregation problems, as income levels improve in neighborhoods and they have access to other kinds of income, the success of transportation systems have been impacted. Citizens begin to prefer prior forms of transportation, especially post-pandemic. There's another aspect we'd like to highlight, and it's the fact, and it's something that has been very underexplored in national research, and it's about assessing the impact when it comes to criminal activity exports. There's an aspect that must be taken into account, and it's that due to the kind of criminal structures in the city and the way that crimes are structured, we believe that this possibility of exporting crime is much lesser when areas that were traditionally poorly connected are connected. These vulnerable or insecure neighborhoods, we believe that the likelihood of exporting crime, that although they exist, are very low when compared to generally. This occurs when there are areas where there is a certain capital that allows them to have their own means for mobility or weapons. So generally these criminal structures that have a behavior logic that is focused on an old economic idea of defending their territory, when they leave their territories to go and conduct criminal activities in locations that are not very near to their centers of activity, they generally have means beyond the public transportation systems. In other words, public transportation systems are not the means through which these criminal structures export their insecurity to locations far from the neighborhoods where they traditionally carry out their criminal activities. I would now like to focus during these last minutes on policy opportunities. And it's that I believe that based on this work that Jorge has just shared with us, it's important to continue connecting the city to the lesser connected areas. In other words, the relatively low likelihood of exporting crime the benefits far outweigh the disadvantages of connecting these neighborhoods, connecting neighborhoods that have a higher level of insecurity traditionally. In the case of Medellin, if we compare the various projects that have been carried out over time, it's important to prioritize those projects that connect neighborhoods that were traditionally underconnected, as well as combine urban improvement activities. So this is an important finding of this study. to identify that there are metros and cable cars that improve connectivity. As far as policy, based on the work that is presented today, it's important to work on land use planning. It's important to improve the urbanistic quality of these neighborhoods through the transportation systems, but it's also important to end, or better said, it's better to generate through land use planning options to have less segregated neighborhoods. One of the main problems we need to face in the case of Medellin is avoiding segregation. And here there's a key aspect that has to do with ending subsidies for public services and taxes on real estate based on social and economic income. And it's that public service subsidies are given to property and not families. And this makes it impossible for families to transition from a low quality urban area to a higher quality urban area. Therefore, it's very important for studies such as these to demonstrate that the foundation needs to be improving the urbanistic quality and everything that revolves around land use planning. And with this, I'll close. It's important to bridge gaps when it comes to access to formal employment in low-income neighborhoods, especially in the northern part of the city. The education that leads to better quality jobs and physical connectivity, as well as internet connectivity. I believe this is of key importance because what needs to be done is avoid this trade-off between jobs, formal jobs and illegal activities or criminal activities. It's important for youth to be able to have access to employment because it's not only a matter of income, but also a matter of status. It's something symbolic that criminal structures offer in many cases. There are many other aspects that I could discuss, but I'll leave it here for today. And I'd like to congratulate the work that Jorge has just shared with us. And there are some aspects with regard to the method that we should assess in the future, such as analyzing households and not individuals, in the sense that the lower income leads to there being people who can use transportation, whereas others can't. So there are some people who end up being excluded from the benefits of greater connectivity. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. And we would like for you to visit us in www.medellincomobamos.org. Thank you very much, Luis Fernando.
These have been our presentations for today. And now we're going to use the few minutes that we have left to open for a few questions. I would first like to invite Jorge if he wants to respond or comment on any of Luis Fernando's points. Otherwise, we can move on to other questions.
Yeah, I don't know, should I respond in English or in Spanish?
English is fine. We still have the interpretation function. Some people can still use it. Or Luis Fernando, are you comfortable with that?
It's okay. It's very fine. Okay.
Thank you.
So I think there are a couple of great points. The first one is that Luis Fernando was saying that we should study the households, not these individual decisions of the agents, right? And you're right. And what's really cool is that we can do that. The CISBEN basically is the census of the 70% poorest. But what is really nice about the CISBEN is that we know where people live, right? But also we know the composition of the household, right? So we will be able to do that. Now it's tricky how this cable affects to find like heterogeneous effects within a specific household or within a family. I think it's a great point. Related to your point about exporting crime, that's a great point. You were saying that is that given the crime dynamics that we have in Medellin, is less likely that you will see these export of criminal activity to other parts of the city. I totally agree with you. The key here, the key thing here is that the effect is pretty small, right? This effect of exporting crime is very, very small, right? Remember that the aggregate effect for the whole city is 10%, a reduction of in the probability of engaging in criminal activities of 10%. So this is a really large effect for the city. But you have these externalities that some people will go to other parts of the city to commit crime. Now, it's very interesting. We haven't explored what type of crime because we can do that. So I think this is a great point. Maybe you will only commit like property crimes in other parts of the city, but and this is the exploding crime that you will see in the data. We will have to study that. And I think the third point goes to I agree with your conclusion that I think it's very important to understand. I think the paper basically concludes that if you want to target specific neighborhoods, you should target those neighborhoods with less formal sector access, right? And what do I mean by that is that those neighborhoods for which it's very difficult to go to downtown to find a formal job. And I agree with you. That's a very powerful conclusion that we can complement with other measures of the neighborhoods, as you were suggesting. We don't have those measures, but happy to think more about how we can include those other measures about, for example, public libraries, right? How these other infrastructures can help to break segregation, right? So thank you so much, Luis Fernando, and that's it.
Thank you, Jorge. I would like to ask both of you one last question before we close, and it's a question related to generalizability of the findings of what you presented, Jorge. So to what degree do you expect these findings could be applied across the region? Or like, are there any specific things that you would highlight to be considered when thinking about this evidence in different contexts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, right? And the answer to your question basically depends on the context, right? I think that what we have in Medellin, right, this segregation, right, of crime and formal jobs opportunities, you will see the same pattern across different cities in Latin America, right? So you will see similar patterns in different cities in developing countries. Now, I also think that cities like New York, Chicago, LA experience a very similar segregation, right? And they had a very similar pattern in the 70s and 80s, right? Before, during the crack of the cocaine, right? In these cities. So I think this is consistent with the history of these large cities in the developed countries, and it's consistent with what you see in other cities in Latin American countries, like cities in Rio. You will see very similar patterns, right? In Buenos Aires, and right. But I think you will also find a very similar pattern in other cities in developing countries. Thanks, Ana.
Sí.
Thank you, Jorge. Luis Fernando, go ahead.
Thank you. Yo creo que hay que tener cuidado porque no necesariamente son extrapolables los resultados.
The findings cannot necessarily be extrapolated for the following reason. First of all, due to the history in Medellin's history, there are some very complex structures that have been present in Medellin historically that ended up managing international drug trafficking networks. This means that Medellin has a series of organizational capabilities on the part of the criminal networks that make them very robust. So, for example, the Godfather 1, 2, and 3, you could say that the criminal organizations in Medellin have very similar relations to Godfather 2 and 3 in the sense that there are historic relations with economic activities such as money laundering and a great deal of complexity when it comes to the capability behind these criminal organizations of managing territories and conducting social regulation. And in some cases, they replace the state when it comes to resolving social conflicts. So problems when there are problems of noise between neighbors are sometimes managed by these criminal structures, whereas in other parts of Latin America, that's not the case. And the capability of these criminal organizations of social regulation is lesser. We also need to question the state-run vigilance organizations. So for example, in Medellin, we don't see the kind of conflicts that we see in Rio. We don't have the police facing up the criminal activities. We only saw that happen with the Orion operation, which is a before and after in the city of Medellin. So we have to see that also the topography is very different. The fact that we have a city that's segregated between the valley and the slopes makes it also be a different urban situation. I think there are some findings that are very useful and that can be extrapolated, such as the fact that it's not enough to just expand transportation networks without urban renovation. This can be extrapolated, whereas I believe the specific conditions to the criminal organizations cannot be extrapolated. We need to understand the dynamics of these criminal structures when linked to the state entities and the ability these criminal organizations have to corrupt social structures and state-owned institutions. So I believe there are some findings that can be extrapolated and others that can't.
Out of our scheduled time, so I would like to invite Mika to close the webinar.
Yes, thank you so much, Jorge and Luis, for the discussion. This was super interesting. So we are going to be done now for the first webinar series. We're going to resume in September with more on organized crime. And as Chris said, we are going to include also other regions, not only Latin America. We're going to move also to Italy to try to understand what things work there and also in the US. Thank you so much, everyone. Hope to see you next. And again, thank you, Jorge and Luis Fernando.